All right. It's almost 5 after, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Um, my name is Chris Barnes. I am digital publishing librarian. I'm very happy to have you all here today, both online and in person. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Kristina Poznan. She is the one of the managing editors of the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation, and one of the key players at enslaved.org. And she is joining us from Connecticut today. Hello, Kristina.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Thanks for being with us today. So today's talk is going to be about using AI and linked open data in the study of historical scholarship, specifically in slavery scholarship. And we're going to be focusing on these 6 topics. So we are first going to look at the fact that there was a very, very large population of enslaved African and African Americans in the New York metropolitan area way up until the 1820s, which is not very well known. And then we'll look at the records of their manumissions that are found at the New York City Municipal Archives and how I turned those into a data set, an article that is published in Kristina's journal. And then Kristina will talk about enslaved.org, which is the database at the heart of the project, as well as the journal itself. And she'll explain how FAIR principles and linked open data are integral to the entire project, to its forward-looking focus and its ability to utilize the latest in information technology and artificial intelligence to make new historical discoveries. And specifically, we'll be looking at some developments regarding handwriting recognition and turning unstructured information into structured information. This is an informal talk, so please feel free to raise your hand or unmute and ask a question. Um, and move right along by saying that this talk was partially inspired by the fact that earlier this year I published an article in this journal. And so I'm excited to tell you about my research. I'm also happy that this is an open access journal and that this is Open Access Week. So happy Open Access Week, everybody. Many of the works that we'll be looking at later on in the presentation are open access works as well. And so you can easily access them online. Open access means not only free to read, but free to reuse in certain ways that are allowed by the author. So in addition to the article, which explains the data, I created a data set. So this is an unusual pairing of a peer-reviewed scholarly article that describes and contextualizes a data set comprising information about those African Americans who were manumitted, the people who manumitted them, and the people involved in that process. So let's start, though, by thinking about Brooklyn. All right. So on the screen right now are some images that you might associate with Brooklyn. We have Coney Island on the bottom. We have the Barclays Center on the top. And on either side, we have some general images of Brooklyn, the subway, and the brownstones. But up until not too long ago, this was Brooklyn. Brooklyn was deeply agricultural up until basically 1900, even after that. Queens and Brooklyn. Queens used to encompass all of Nassau County. Queens and Brooklyn were the most prolific agricultural producing counties in all of America at the start of the 19th century, mainly because they had two things: an enormous market in New York City and a lot of manure from all of the animals in New York City, which really, really amped up the productivity of the agriculture in the area and made it, prior to the 1820s, really, really a center of enslaved labor. It's what's called the wheat industrial complex. And we're going to be talking more about the fact that especially in New York and New Jersey, there was a real fight against ending slavery, fight against emancipation, a real desire to continue enslaving people. And the first enslaved Africans arrived in what is today New York, what was New Amsterdam in 1627. Fast forward to the American Revolution, and New York is once again a very large center of African Americans because they are escaping to the British. The British offered freedom for anyone who came over to the British side, and therefore New York City becomes this major hub during the war of people of color. And then after the war, we're still seeing the enslaved community increase even into the 1780s and 90s. And by the 1790s, we're seeing something between 25 and 35% of towns in Kings County, what is today coterminous with Brooklyn, are enslaved. And that is a proportion, 1/3 of the population, that is comparable only with places like Charleston, South Carolina at this time, in terms of density of enslaved population. There's a much smaller free Black community as well, something that grows over time. But it wasn't until 1799 that gradual emancipation was actually passed in New York, again, over the extreme objections of most of the Dutch farmers in Kings County in northern New Jersey, who relied heavily on that workforce. And so the 1799 law, when it finally was passed, freed absolutely no one. If you were born on 4th of July, 1799 or after, you were considered an indentured servant, and you had to serve the master or owner of your mother for 24 years if you're a woman, 26 years if you're a man. I have those correct. And so it was a law that did lead to emancipation, but it made sure to not, it made sure to protect the property rights of the enslavers and allow them to divest themselves of this quote unquote property, right, in a time frame in a manner that allowed them to recoup their losses. Considerations like that were not offered for the African American community. As a result of the gradual emancipation law, and this is really important for my work, those who enslaved individuals had to go to the town clerk and say, so and so, my enslaved woman Harriet gave birth to a boy named Henry on such and such a date. So very frequently, however, we don't get the mother's name. We only get the first name of the child, and we get the date. But little pieces of information like that are gold for reconstructing African American history. And one of the reasons why AI and linked open data is so valuable in this space is because we have such fragmentary data, such incomplete understanding and information about people of color prior to 1870, prior to the first census after emancipation. It's often considered a brick wall for African American genealogists who are trying to trace their families beyond 1870. And many of the records that I'll be talking about today are directly relevant to African American genealogical work. The idea being that in these records are the names of individuals who went on to become emancipated and live free lives. And eventually we'd like to connect up the census records, right, from their individuals post-emancipation with information about them and their lives and their families and their work before emancipation, when they were enslaved, okay? And so slavery legally ends in 1827 in New York, and what was just being covered up there is the fact that slavery never actually was abolished in New Jersey, okay? They just waited until 1865 and the passage of the 13th Amendment to abolish quote unquote slavery in New Jersey. So that's a fact that very few people know, and there were people enslaved in New Jersey in the 1850s. There was a slave schedule. They were usually elderly, but it was still in existence and it was still legal. And so now we're looking at the specific towns in Brooklyn, what is today Brooklyn, what was then considered Kings County, which we know today by different names, right? Originally, Brooklyn was right here. It was a town, it was a village, and it was spelled Brooklyn because Brooklyn is the Dutch version of the same town in the Netherlands. And New Amersfoort is today the neighborhood of Flatlands. Amersfoort is another town in the Netherlands. And then Midwood eventually became Flatbush. Boswick became Bushwick. New Utrecht became New Utrecht, and then Gravesend was actually founded by the English. So this is the area that we're talking about here. And you'll notice Flatlands, Flatbush. They're called Flatlands and Flatbush because, unsurprisingly, they're incredibly flat, okay? They were also incredibly fertile agricultural areas, right, which is why we see the extensive agricultural labor and produce out of these regions, okay? And so if we If we now think about each one of these towns, okay, Flatbush and Flatlands and Brooklyn maintaining their own records, right? So this is way before consolidation of New York City, of all the different boroughs coming together. All of them kept individual records, okay? They had their own town clerks and everything. And these records were eventually in the 20th century, moved over to the New York City Municipal Archives, but they were never digitized, okay? So if you wanted to see them, you actually had to go down to Lower Manhattan to the New York City Municipal Archives and take a look, okay? But fairly recently, in the last few years, thanks to a grant, there was a digitization project undertaken at the New York City Municipal Archives, which made a lot of these records available online for the first time. But of course, while they were pictured or photographed, they were not searchable. They were not OCR. These are handwritten documents, right? So in order to make them searchable, in order to take the names of the individuals who were emancipated, the names of the people who were born in slavery, and make them findable, discoverable online, that content needs to be put into a machine readable format, into a format that can get uploaded to databases, can get analyzed using computers. And that's what this project is about. It's about making the information inside of archival repositories that has been digitized actually keyword searchable and accessible by AI. And we'll talk about why that's important in a moment. And so on the right-hand side now, you're seeing an example of one of the manumission documents, number 5. And manumission means the legal emancipation or freeing of an individual from slavery. The law stipulated that if you wanted to set someone free, you had to get usually at least 4 signatures. And that in 1799 was actually way better than it used to be, because prior to that, you had to put up a 200-pound bond if you wanted to liberate one of your slaves. The idea being that the community did not think, or they were concerned, that that individual would be a burden on the community. And if that individual was a burden on the community, then they wanted to be able to have your money to pay for it. It was always about ensuring that no money was coming out of the public coffers to support this information, to support these individuals. And once that condition was taken away, we see this real flood of manumissions in the 1790s and the early 1800s, which lead to these flood of documentation of manumissions and births and abandonments, okay? And as you can see, it's not very easy to read on the right-hand side there, but that's the good version. That is the transcribed version. The bad version, or the untranscribed version, and this is a good instance, okay, is on the left-hand side. And this is an example of a birth record. At the top, it says, to William Cowenhoven, town clerk of the town of Flatlands. These are to certify that a male child is born to one of my female slaves on the 3rd day of December, 1804, which child is named Joe. Writing my hand this 2nd day of April, 1805, George Flott, William Cowenhoven, town clerk. Now you notice that everything is in the same hand. This was written down by William Cowenhoven, right, in the presence of those individuals. And so if we wanted to get those names out of there, right, first of all, we have to figure out how to read that. Well, nowadays, students aren't learning how to write and read cursive, right? So it's getting harder and harder to not only access this information, but also to read it for earlier generations. So it's even more pressing need to enable this to be machine readable, okay? And so the question becomes, how do we not only transcribe this information, but organize it in a way that we can load it up into databases and make it searchable? Just in the same way that you would go into OneSearch and do a keyword search or a metadata search or a historical period search, you would want the same kind of options for this kind of information. And so I was extremely pleased to discover enslaved.org and the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation, because they have specifically foreseen this, the rise of AI, the need for machine readability, and have organized their database and their journal to be suitable and applicable in this new environment. And I'm very happy to turn it now over to my colleague, Dr. Kristina Poznan, and she can explain more about enslaved.org's model and workflow.
Thank you. Chris, can I trouble you to advance slides for me?
Absolutely.
Great. So one place to start is that there has been movement to kind of share information and resources on line since the beginning of the internet. But there were certain problems with it, or limitations to earlier models that really needed updating before moving forward. One of that is that something like the soldiers database. I'm gonna have someone come and grab him in a second. Would show you search results that you found. So, like, you could search for a specific soldier, but you had to know who you were looking for, and you could only see those results, not the full database. Something like the Dawes rules, which documented Native Americans who enslaved people of African ancestry, the Cherokee Freedom Rolls, would again only show you search results, not actually let you see the full database. In the bottom left corner, something like 10 million names, put him in bed if he rubs his eyes, would allow you to see search hits and even link you to the primary source document, but wouldn't let you, again, see the data. And then in the top right corner, ICPSR, this is one of the early data repositories. They are behind a paywall. And so if your university subscribes to it, you can utilize that data, but if your university does not, it is not available. And there are much more severe restrictions on how you can use that information and replicate it. Next slide. Next slide, if you don't mind. Oh, we went two. Sorry.
Oh.
There we go. So the newer generation of projects have sought to address this. Things like the New Jersey Slavery Records Project, Sold Down River, Kinfolkology, the Citing Slavery Project, and Freedom on the Move, and Slave Voyages, the project that people are most likely to be familiar with, have all tried to address this by making their data much more transparent. So on all of these sites, you can see the actual spreadsheet that you're trying to use. Oftentimes you can download results. The problem with this, this is all wonderful, right? This is great. This is the new generation of projects. It's really important in cutting edge research. If you are not a research expert, it is hard to know about all of them, how to use all of them individually, and how to sort of connect the dots on people. So there are a couple of projects out there that are trying to aggregate this. The Northeast Slavery Records Index out of John Jay College is worth mentioning because they will connect records from various projects that are related to the Northeast. But if you have anyone who is sold, say, from the Northeast to the South in periods at which that slave trade still exists, then it's hard to follow them across other platforms. Therefore, next slide, please. Enslaved.org was founded as a discovery tool to connect these very important projects and make their findings more searchable simultaneously. And we'll get into a little bit of the detail about how we do that once we talk about sort of some of the aspects of the project specifically. Next. So the way that we decided to bring in projects into enslaved.org and to make sure that people sort of understood what they were looking at when it came to data is to found something called the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation. And using an academic journal was a way to sort of make what we collect familiar to scholars and people who might... One moment, please.
Sure.
To make people sort of know what they're looking at was to sort of bring projects under this umbrella of a journal together. And one of the critiques of this was that when people put data online in an open repository, there often wasn't enough text to tell you what you were looking at. And so if you dump a data set in GitHub, you like don't know where the information came from beyond sort of like, the name of the creator, or, it was really a crapshoot how much contextualizing info was available. So we standardized this with a process that we called a data article. Next slide, please. In which we had a template and it allowed people to sort of share all of this information. So, where did this data come from? What sources? How did you go from, as Chris just described, the process of having an archival collection or a single archival document and turning it into a spreadsheet that was searchable and interoperable with other information? And so, the data article lets us kind of set a standard of how to do that and make sure that critical context, is available for all of the data that's available. Next, please. So here is an example of a data deposit. I think that it's really important to highlight again that this is placed in an open platform. We partner with the Harvard Dataverse to deposit the data sets that are then connected in the enslaved.org kind of data ecosystem. And so at the Dataverse, you can find all kinds of data available for free. This is what we chose because they had the best long-term digital sustainability plan. So even if enslaved.org were to lose all of its funding, and then 15 years from now the people at the university have sort of let the site decay, we have no plans to let any of this happen. Digital sustainability is in a much better place than it was when, the project was first envisioned, et cetera. But the Harvard Dataverse had a great sustainability plan, and it seemed like a very sustainable place to deposit the data. Next, please. And so you see here, we offer not only the downloadable data set, but also documentation. So further description of what is in this data set, field for field. So one of the things that people realized was a problem is that when you have humans creating column headings, it's not really clear what they mean. So is the name column the name of the enslaved person or the enslaver? Is the place where the person lived, or is it where they were recorded or registered? So all of these things are then defined in the data documentation. And when we talk about fair data in a second, it will become even clearer why all of these kinds of things, even though they seem overkill and perhaps obvious, are really important. Next. And I want to highlight that unlike some of the sites I mentioned at the very beginning, you can see all of the data, not just search results. So we do have a search feature, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second, but you get to see, in addition, all of the raw data. So this is data coming from a newspaper in Brazil, and you see that it's the Jornal de Comercio. You see exactly what issue and volume it is. You have availability of the URL, what date, what the advertisement is for. In this case, it's for the arrival of slave ships and people who are sold off of them. And so you get not only the search results if you're like looking for a specific person, but also if you want to see, for example, what percentage were men and what percentage were women, you can see all of the data and kind of make those calculations yourself. So it's much more user friendly for various research projects. And also if you're, say, trying to find people who are related and you only have one of their names, but they're listed right next to each other in the original source, then you're much more likely to be able to find them if you can see the entire database. Next. So I wanted to just work with one short source to kind of show why augmenting data is really important. This is a list of slaves and free persons of color in the penitentiary of Virginia. So it's the Virginia State Prison from 1816 to 1842. And then you'll see this is what their kind of like ledger looks like for people of color and enslaved people who are thrown into the prison there, recording information about who enters it. Next. And so you'll see that there are certain things, obviously they're hard to read, but in the boxes are certain inconsistencies. So one of the things we see is that date is recorded in an inconsistent manner. Sometimes it will have year, month, day. Other times it will just have month and day because it's assuming that you see the 1816 from above, but it doesn't carry all the way through. This becomes really difficult then for when it becomes a spreadsheet because then you don't have sort of that 1816 there on each line anymore to help you know where to go. And then DO is the old abbreviation for ditto, right? So meaning more of the same. And so for Matthew Jr., it doesn't repeat Cumberland and Cape Booker. And so if you were looking for search results, then you wouldn't, and you searched Cape Booker, he wouldn't show up because his owner's name shows up as ditto and not as the name. Next slide. And so when someone is preparing a data set for publication, what they can do is standardize things to be more compatible with computing. And so here you see that the dates have all been recorded in the same way. All of the dittos have been replaced with the actual content that they're referring to. And then when you do a search, it's much clearer what you're looking at rather than having those kinds of dittos and other things in the primary source that were perhaps a little inconsistent. Next. And so all of these things that we're talking about are what make linked open data work. Linked open data is obviously open access, hence the open in its name. And then the really underlying important principle that I want to emphasize here is that it follows what are called fair data principles. This means that the data is findable. That there is a discovery tool, that it's indexed in various places, it's accessible, so there's no paywall. It is interoperable. It is set up in a way that different programs and people can use it. So this means that rather than using proprietary file types like, say, Excel, we assume that Excel is ubiquitous, but not everyone has Excel. But if you save an Excel file as a CSV file, all you do is hit file save, and it's a different file format you can save as. Then someone who doesn't have Excel, who say is a Mac user and has the numbers program instead, can open it too. And so that's interoperability and reusability. So you save it in the file type that is the simplest so that if computing changes tremendously over time, it is still uh, usable in ways that are sort of less subject to digital rot. So if you say saved something on a CD-ROM, right, that most people wouldn't be able to play it anymore. But if you saved something as, say, like a digital file type that was kind of uh, marked as the best type for sustainability, that it would extend its kind of shelf life. And then Chris will talk a little bit more about the AI connection with knowledge graphs and large language models in a second. Next. As part of our commitment to fair principles, we have a lot of documentation available on our website, and this is all for sort of maximum transparency and maximizing the likelihood that other people can create data that is interoperable as well. So we have our linked open data files for the entire project are downloadable here. That's revolutionary, right? It's not just that you can download Chris's project on its own, or the project that a different historic site submits on its own. You can download the entire thing. Obviously you have to have like the hard drive space to do it, but it is like radical transparency and openness. And then we also have all sorts of guidance on how to create good data if you are interested in doing it yourself. Next. And so what I wanted to show you here is our commitment to open access. And so I've put stars next to a handful of components that are important for this discussion. We assign DOIs, digital object identifiers, to all of our data articles, which is what you see on the left, and then also to all of the data sets, which you see on the right. And these are really stable URLs. So even if websites fundamentally change, DOIs are stable and will still connect you to the right source, even if people fundamentally redo their websites. In the lower set of stars, you'll also see our Creative Commons licensing. So we use Creative Commons by NCSA 4.0 international licenses. And this stipulates what the conditions are for using our data, and they're intentionally very liberal. So, B by stands for the fact that you're allowed to use the data openly so long as you credit the creator. So you have to recognize who it's by. And C means for non-commercial uses. So you're allowed to reproduce the data for free if you want to, so long as you don't make any money off of it. Share alike means that anything that you make using our data, say you created your own spreadsheet by merging two enslaved.org spreadsheets and then focusing only on women. You have to make that shareable under the same terms. You're not allowed to say put it behind a paywall, or to share it in ways that other people can't use and utilize it as well. You have to share alike. So you put the same conditions on its reuse as what you pulled. And then 4.0, it just means the newest version, and international being that it's not just for users in the United States, but abroad as well. Next. And so here is the enslaved.org data platform. And you'll see, for example, that when you search Virginia, you have a handful of results pop up, and you can search each of them individually. But the part I want to emphasize is that then you can also search across them simultaneously. And so this is really important when you have context in which you're looking for people who are sold between, say, owners, and then there's even broader filters that you can use to connect the results to people who are sold to Louisiana, or even abroad, or from the Caribbean to the United States, etc. Next. And then I also wanted to highlight our ability to sort of search across data sets with one single example. And some of you might have heard of John Henry from the folk song. John Henry was a little baby sitting on his daddy's knee. The one who races a steam drill press. Bruce Springsteen covered it a few years ago, but John Henry was a real historical figure. And so you don't have to go separately to the Library of Virginia data sets, the Black Virginians in Blue data sets, the other collections. You can search across all of them for hits of John Henry at the same time, and you get 94. Obviously, some of these you still have to kind of like filter out as a human. Some of them are not going to be at the right time period. There's further filters I could have applied to kind of narrow the list even further. But when you're able to do a search in a linked open data environment, you're much more likely to get the hit that you're looking for, especially since the archive of slavery specifically is so fragmented, rather than having to sort of, only find one and then having to go to a completely different website to find other hits from there. Next. I believe this is back to you, Chris.
Yes.
Great.
Yes,
Thank you.
You bet. Thank you. But before we move on, any questions? I know we've thrown a lot at you, rather technical. Any questions online or any questions in the room? Okay. Yes, Andy.
So you say that if a data set is downloaded and used, maybe you're combining two data sets, how enforceable is it that someone can't put it behind a paywall? Like, what would you have to do if someone did put a new, combined data set behind a paywall?
Yeah. The Creative Commons Association will sometimes sort of work with someone who's identified a violation to sort of send a cease and desist notice. But you're right that enforceability is a problem, but sort of in terms of like, good stewards of the internet, a lot of times people commit violations unknowingly, right? And so the initial benefit of CC licenses is that at least people know what's allowed, right? And then there's the next level of enforcement. So Creative Commons does have an entire legal team, and you can work with them in cases that are necessary. But the first line of defense is just knowing, putting out there in very clear terms what the stipulations are for use. And so that solves 90-95% of your problems, is that you've stated what's allowed. And so it is not 100% of the solution, but it gets you very large portion of the way there.
I would also say that, some of the terminology like the share alike isn't always fully understood. So people might put the wrong license on something. And oftentimes it's simply a matter of explaining to them, what the terms of the license are. That essay is also what Wikipedia uses, for example, not the NC, but the essay, just to make sure that everything downstream stays open. And one of the, one of the protections against that is you put some of the stuff behind a paywall, like, unless it's transformed in that way, it's still accessible outside of that environment, so there's less incentive. But yeah, it can be a problem, especially more in like publishing, like people stealing chapters and republishing them and trying to sell them. Great question. Any other questions? Okay. So this is actually a screenshot of the data set that I created, which is called the Brooklyn Old Town Records Collection. And you can see that each one of these records has a bunch of information listed, just as we saw on the last screen. And so I want to just click on one of them and show you the manumission of Jack right here. We're going to open this. Oh, sorry. So part of what I wanted to show here is that all of these connections, right? So you'll see under manumission of Jack, there's 6 individuals, there's a location, right? But what we want to be able to do is figure out and expand on what all the connections are between these people, right? So all these people are in this data set, but they might have other connections between them that we don't know, right? And that's where AI can really come in handy. And it's where linked open data enables AI to do its job. So a linked open data, sort of the goal of linked open data is to link all data, all right? And this is the current linked open data cloud. I enhanced or I enlarged the legend, so you can see that all the different colors are different sort of enormous segments of information like social networking, government, life sciences. But buried inside here is enslaved.org, and buried inside of enslaved.org is my data set. And what I could do is try to figure out, by asking AI to analyze my knowledge graph, what other connections are out there. What other, like, for example, if one enslaver is related to another enslaver, it could be that I'm able to find a family connection in the enslaved by tracking that or asking AI to do that, okay? So this very enormous, very interconnected web is the linked open data web. And the idea is that this looks fundamentally different than a database, right? A relational database is going to have grids and boxes and columns, and it's going to operate fundamentally differently. And so this is the next iteration, if you will, of how we organize knowledge. It's a way that allows for new connections to be discovered, okay? And so if we look into the manumission of Jack and we look at all the individuals located here on the bottom, right, each one of these individuals has a unique identifier, meaning that John Hicks participant in this record is different than a John Hicks in a different record unless we go about connecting them, right? And the idea is we do want to connect them, because if we can connect them, then we can connect other things as well. And so what we are doing here is looking at a very nice human-friendly version, right, of data that has been made machine readable. And if we want to get a peek at what that actual data looks like once it's been transformed, we can click on one of these, and I'm going to show you what RDF XML looks like. Okay, so when a computer actually gets this information, this is how the computer gets and reads the information. It might look like HTML to you, for example, It's XML. The ML stands for markup language. So all of these tags on the left and the right-hand side are telling the computer what that information is, how to understand that information, what language that information is in. So for example, manumission of Jack in English is right here, okay? But it's hard to see because of all the other contextual information that is going along with it. But all of that contextual information, all of that metadata, right, all of that XML is required to find the connections to enable AI to do its job, okay? And so let's talk about what AI is actually capable of doing with this information. And I'm going to move this so you can see the smiley Happy Open Access Week sign here. Okay, and so we're going to be looking now at some of the latest publications, scholarly publications that are exploring the ways that we can use AI and linked open data in historical archival scholarship. And so this one is from Archive, ARXIV, which is a preprint server. Preprints are scholarly articles that have not yet been peer reviewed. So this is like a first draft of a peer-reviewed article, the idea being that you place it online with the hope of other people commenting on it and improving it for its final published version. And you can see that the title of this one is Handwriting Recognition in Historical Documents with Multimodal LLM. Multimodal LLM, or large language models, are large language models that can incorporate audio and video and images in addition to text. Mode means just mode of information, textual, image, sound. And so what we're seeing on the right-hand side is an experiment of using AI, multimodal AI, which can read photographs, which can pick out text, which can organize unstructured data into structured data, like we saw in the last slide. On the right, we're seeing the human transcribed version on the left in red, the Gemini transcribed version in the middle, and then on the right, the original version. And you can see that if I move this. Sorry, I can't. There. These are error counts, okay? So the human transcribed gets 4.6, all right? Let's skip to the next slide. It's also a matter of the language itself. So this is a character error rate distribution, and this is an analysis of how accurate the AI is in actually making a transcription. And you can see that the blue goes way the heck up there, right? It's way worse at German than it is at English and French. Now, you might say, well, that doesn't make much sense. They're all in the same alphabet. But the fact is that that document may be in a much more difficult hand, right, in addition to being in a different language. But it could also be the nature of the language model that is doing the analysis, okay? Because we need to train AI in order for it to understand how to do this stuff. This is yet another article. It's called Exploring AI-Driven Approaches for Unstructured Document Analysis and Future Horizons. This was just published last year. It is open access in the Journal of Big Data. And I selected this one because of the diagram on the right-hand side. At the top, you can see the goal, which is to be able to transcribe, understand, and make machine-readable documents like forms that are completed by hand, all right? A good example of that would be that blends structured and handwritten data would be like a census record, for example, okay? But imagine your own notes from high school or let's say graduate school. If you have them scanned, right, you can potentially use this software to go through and structure all that information, supposing you wanted to, right, and cull those nuggets out of your old manuscript notebooks from graduate school. But you can see at the bottom here that there are lots of different industry contexts for this kind of work. Travel sector, insurance sector, banking sector, agricultural. And so very frequently we see the advances in these areas come because of their industry intersections, because of the capability of industry to adopt these, make money off of it, and pay for this kind of research moving forward. But it is exactly this kind of research that can also help with the more scholarly academic uses of AI that we've been talking about here. Just to make it clear that AI is really complicated and is doing a lot behind the scenes, This is a workflow for getting from just a paper-based, well, electronic, but paper-based document all the way over to the final summary of data. And you can see that it goes through the scanning, right, to the data pre-processing. One term I'll pick up here is tokenization. Tokenization is what happens to content before it goes into the LLM. So if you have a Word document of 1,000 words, you have at least 1,000 tokens. Sometimes the punctuation and the spaces are also tokenized. Under feature extraction, entity-based feature extraction techniques, this is the actual mapping of the spaces and the interstices of the document, okay? Then it needs to classify all of those things that it has found. And once it classifies those, it tries to learn and understand why those structures have been used. Why is it using one classification model as opposed to another classification model? This is where recurrent neural networks come into play, lots of deep learning happening here. And then eventually, once it's learned and it's been trained, we can move over to actual text recognition where we're getting to the individual characters being converted. And then we get into what those characters mean. And then eventually we get down to the final summary of data, whereupon a human being actually reads it and is like, this ain't right. It still requires a human being to come in there and evaluate it, which is why crowdsourcing is a really big part of historical data preservation. So if you go into the National Archives, they have 5 billion images of handwritten manuscript documents, and they are actively using AI like this and better to come up with transcriptions, right? But it isn't until a human being goes in there and is able to evaluate those transcriptions that they can actually pass muster in the end. The level of human intervention is becoming less and less, but it's becoming less and less as the need for training is becoming more and more. So there's actually been calls within the industry for figure out better ways at self-training these models. And the last article I wanted to bring up is the most recent multimodal LLMs for OCR post-correction, and named entity recognition in historical documents. This is arguably one of the sort of like brass rings shooting after. This is the idea that not only could it do everything we've been talking about, but could it pick George Washington, per se, or Frederick Douglass out of a historical text and then be able to recognize that as a individual historical unit and make connections from that. And so this takes a lot of prompting on the part of the user. And we think of AI as being extremely intelligent, and it is, but it is also extremely I haven't figured out how to exactly articulate this. It's got enormous computing brain power, but it doesn't know the difference between true and false. So we need to give it as much guidance, as much context, as much instruction as we possibly can, which is why prompt engineering is a major field in AI right now. And so what you see on the screen on the right-hand side is the prompt that these authors would generate in order to accomplish the kind of OCR and named entity recognition that they were able to achieve in this document. And I put it up on the screen in part just to show you like how mean you have to be, how strict you have to be with a large language model in order to actually ensure it's giving you stuff that you can rely on. You are an expert historian. Your task is to extract data from a scan of a German business directory. Failure to follow these rules exactly will result in total system failure. There is zero room for error, okay? Now, this sounds horrible, right, if you're a human being, but as a machine, this is your way of attempting to restrict, right, what is often something that's very hard to restrict, right, and to make it organized in a way that is compatible with the results that you want to find. And so you give it a series of formats, right? JSON is JavaScript object notation language. It's one of the languages that the internet linked open data runs on. But you can also see that it has non-negotiable rules that are all there and must be followed. And then we are given a strictly enforced example output, so it knows exactly what we are looking for. And then once again, we give it final commands regarding what to do if it has any questions or it has any indeterminacy, and that failure to follow these rules, once again, is that it leads to complete failure and there is zero room for error. And so we are still very much trying to figure out how to harness and use LLMs and artificial intelligence in ways that are actually concordant with the ways that we can use this information and that we can rely on that information. And with that, I hope we have given you a little glimpse into the current and future of historical scholarship using archives and artificial intelligence linked open data. And with that, I thank you, and I thank my colleague Kristina, and we ask you if you have any questions.
I have a super geeky question. Because
Awesome.
I love optical character recognition, and I can't stop thinking about those ditto marks, right? Because that's the opposite of the way optical character recognition works. It works line by line scanning characters, but ditto marks correspond to vertically aligned data. Is there any progress on like AI parsing that? Like, can it make sense out of the ditto marks, given the way optical character recognition works?
Yeah, if you write your prompt carefully, there are ways to get them to convert that. Honestly, depending on the size of your data set, it is sometimes faster to just copy and paste and do it, right? So you have, we have one data contributor who is, for example, taking OCR PDFs and having them using AI to export them into a spreadsheet. And right now, because of the size of the data set, it was faster for him to like go in and turn the ditto marks, just by copying and pasting. But for something larger, then you can do a second round of commands where you explain, make it into the thing above it. So yes, but right now so much of the effort is sort of like still focused on learning to write the commands properly to get it done. Chris, do you have more to add to that?
No, that's my understanding as well, and it's why I put the prompt up there on the board, because it's still super complicated to make it work the way we want to, and like copying and pasting is still like an option because we're still working in these platforms, but yeah, ideally it's going to change, but right now it's still to happen. Yes.
And there's a data remediation program called Open Refine, which a lot of people use to sort of clean up their data after they've created it. And it's what we use in enslaved.org as we prepare to link data. And one of the things that Open Refine can help you do is, column by column, you can tell it to sort of replace ditto marks with the things above it. So there is an intermediary generation of tools that kind of facilitate it that still require some degree of human input, but thankfully it's not like, zero help at all.
Yeah, great question. Any other questions or anyone online have a question? You can just unmute. Oh yeah. Thanks, Kim. Okay.
If
All
I
right.
can, I'll make a plug for other data repositories that are sort of, engaged in similar work. So if, enslaved.org is not relevant to the work that you're doing, there are other things like the Magazine of Early American Datasets for early American history broadly that are collecting data. There's so much stuff on Dataverse that's available that you can use. Dataverse's preferred license is CC0. So public domain that like there's no restrictions on use at all. That didn't make sense for enslaved.org data specifically for publication in the journal. But the amount of data that is readily available to be able to like use for new kinds of research projects is just expanding daily. So if those aren't resources that you're already looking at when you're working on your papers and stuff, definitely should do so.
Yeah. There, and earlier Kristina mentioned all those other active crowdsourcing projects and databases. Like it's really easy to get involved and to find something that is directly relevant to your historical interests. So just searching around for those databases is also a great idea. So with that, I will thank Kristina one more time and all of you for your attention and wish you a great day. Thanks, Kristina.